Well, today we are looking through the story of Luke. We've gotten up to the 14th chapter, and we're looking at Luke 14, starting in the 31st verse. Jesus is giving people the good news, bad news about the kingdom. The good news is that Jesus is going to tell you the straight story, and that you cannot do anything because Jesus has done it all before you in terms of your salvation. But in terms of following Jesus, high cost if you want to do it. So Jesus, talking to the people there, says, you're not going to build a tower, ideally, if you don't sit down and do a cost analysis. Can you afford it? Do you have the resources? There are many people in business today that they're launching out on an enterprise, they get halfway, and then the bank says, we aren't going to give you any more money. And the project stops. Just sits there. A shell of your dream. Jesus says, don't do that. Figure out the cost in advance. See if you can afford it or not. As a second example, Jesus says this one on the screen. What king going out to wage war would not first consider whether it's possible or not to win? You've got to figure it out. Figure out the odds, especially if you've got 10,000 people on your side, the other king has 20,000, you've got to figure it out. Don't get your people out there before you figure out, do you have a strategy that can win in such a situation? You're outnumbered, you're outgunned. You still might be able to win if you have a strategy or a particular geography or a particular understanding or something. But if it's just 10,000 against 20,000, you're going to lose. And you better, before you endanger the lives of all your soldiers, you better figure out you're going to lose and surrender. Go ahead and ask for the terms of peace, but long before the battle starts. You're going to lose the battle. Don't start the battle. Why go through the fight if you know you're going to lose? Just find out, okay, we're going to skip all my people dying. What, if we'd have had the war, what would be the terms of surrender? So Jesus, in this context of saying there's a price, and you need to figure out in advance if you can afford it, says, okay, now I'm going to tell you the price of following me. Some people might want to just say, I want to follow Jesus. Jesus says, wait a minute. You need to find out what it's going to cost you. Maybe you do want to follow me. Maybe you don't. Because here's what it's going to cost. Jesus says, none of you can become my disciple if you don't give up all your possessions. You've got some things? Awesome. You got to give them up. Later in the Gospel, in the 18th chapter, we see this getting worked out in the life of one person. Comes up to Jesus, says, good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus first doesn't answer the question, first comments on the good teacher part of it. He says, why do you call me good? No one's good but God alone. So your interpretation of that might split depending on what you think about Jesus. So one evaluation of Jesus was he was just a person just like anybody else and who was giving honor and glory to God. And that's an okay interpretation, I guess, but that's not what the New Testament says. The New Testament says Jesus was sinless. He was, in fact, good. And he was, in fact, God. And that this way of Jesus talking was a way for Jesus when it was not possible for him to legally say who he actually was without being killed for saying it. It was a way for him to kind of cajole the crowds into thinking, wow, who is this person? And to, in the context of the time when he could not admit that he was the Son of God, for them to begin to be able to figure it out. Why do you call me good? No one's good but God alone. And one way to interpret this is, the implication is, Jesus is God. Well, then Jesus answers the question that the person said. The person wanted to know, how can I inherit eternal life? Jesus said, well, follow the commandments. Don't commit adultery. Don't murder. Don't steal. Don't bear false witness. Don't lie about somebody. Those are the don'ts. And then honor your father and mother. So when Jesus talks about the Ten Commandments and holds up ones that this particular individual should follow, it's kind of remarkable. Jesus skips all the ones about God and just sticks with the ones about your relationship to people. Honor your father and mother, and then don't commit adultery, don't murder, don't steal, don't bear false witness. And for this particular individual, it wasn't satisfying. It wasn't enough. He told Jesus, I've done that. I've kept all these things since my youth, but doesn't feel like it's enough. Or Jesus says, there's still one thing that's lacking for you. The Gospel of Luke usually doesn't omit anything that the Gospel of Mark records. The Gospel of Mark has a particular story about Jesus, and Luke pretty much includes all the details of Mark. But here's an exception. In this particular story, Mark adds a detail that Luke doesn't tell us, and it's worth knowing. From Mark 10, Jesus, looking at him, loved him. There's from time to time when you're going to hear a strong word of Jesus that you say, I don't know if I can do that. When Jesus tells you something that seems nearly impossible for you to do, you need to know that Jesus is looking at you in love as he says that. That Jesus tells us things out of great compassion, out of fondness for us, because he loves us. And so Jesus, looking at this man, loved him and said, there's one thing that you lack. Here it is. Sell everything you own. Distribute the money to the poor, and then come follow me. And this individual, Mark says, when he heard this, he was shocked. And he went away grieving. Well, one of the things that happens as you read through the Gospels or read through the epistles, the letters are written to particular people. So we kind of eavesdrop. When the letter to the Corinthians, we read, and then does it apply to La Jolla Lutheran? Does it apply to La Jolla or San Diego? Or maybe some parts of it, and some parts maybe not. Just depends. So there's things that Paul wrote to Timothy that you should not follow. It was to Timothy. So as you read through the letters, you need to figure out, is this for me? Is it generally for everybody? Was it for a particular time? And same with this particular story of Jesus. Was this Jesus' advice to everybody? Or just to this one particular person? And if Jesus talked to you, he would name for you something just as hard, but different, based on you. Well, for this particular story, what we know is what we read just a few moments ago, that Jesus says, none of you can become my disciple if you don't give up all your possessions. As Jesus says this, he's saying it in the context of things. Cars, houses, refrigerators, bank accounts. But I believe that it's not just things that Jesus is talking about. And as you read in the context, I think it's fairly apparent that Jesus means far more than just the coins in your pocket or the bills in your wallet or the things in your house. So for some of you, that would be enough. That would be a deal breaker right there. My Porsche? Are you kidding? But for Jesus, it goes beyond even that. We're going to get to that, but first we're going to take a look for reinforcement for some of you who think, oh, Jesus was wrong. He couldn't possibly have meant that. We'll take a look at a couple of other. 1 Timothy, this is Paul's advice to Timothy. Those who want to be rich fall into temptation and are trapped by senseless and harmful desires. I hope he's wrong, because I'd like to be rich. I have a lot of projects that I would really like to see come to fruition, and they're going to take massive resources. But most of the time, Paul's not wrong. So it's worth considering, is this apply to me, or is it just to Timothy? Those who want to be rich fall into temptation and are trapped by senseless and harmful desires. Those desires plunge people into ruin and destruction. So the trajectory is not good. The love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. So people, if you attend a wealth seminar in America, they will be sure that you know that this verse says the love of money, not money. That they want to be clear that you can pursue money, it's just you can't pursue the love of money. The love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. In their eagerness to be rich, some have wandered away from the faith. So for Paul, the real problem with pursuing something other than God is you often get it, that thing instead of God. So if your focus is, I have to have a happy family, I have to have a happy family, and that's the only thing you focus on instead of God, you might be able to get it and lose God, and that's not worth it. That's true for anything you make an idol of. Great-looking body, wealth, fame, whatever it is that you idolize. But in this context, Paul's talking about wealth and the desire of it. Paul says to Timothy, pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, endurance, gentleness. If you pursue those things, you're on a good track. Hebrews, on this same topic, says, keep your lives free from the love of money and be content with what you have. So one of the ways to be able to sort and evaluate how you're doing in this is, well, what's my level of contentment? Am I happy with the things I have? Or do I dislike what I have and I'm always looking for something else? And as soon as I get that, well, no, actually, once I get it, it's only going to last for a little while, and then it'll be something that I have, and I won't be content with it either. But that new thing, as soon as once I get that, after a while, I won't care for it either because I'm not content. If that's your status, it's not the things, it's you. The contentment doesn't come from things. It's an inner state. You're either content or you're not. It's immaterial what you have. It's immaterial who's president in terms of your level of contentment. It's immaterial about all the outside circumstances. The question is, are you a contented person? Are you thankful? Are you rejoicing? Are you glad? Are you worshiping God? Keep your lives free from the love of money, Hebrews says. Be content with what you have. Jesus says, none of you can become my disciple if you don't give up all your possessions. All right, so we're going to use the last of our time to talk about what Jesus might mean besides things when he talks about possessions. We're going to take a look at one of the most troubling stories in the Bible. As far as I'm concerned, it's from Genesis. Terah was Abraham's dad. When Terah came to Haran, they settled there. Terah was on his way to Canaan. But when he got to Haran, he said, this is good enough. And many of you know people like that or are people like that, where you had something grand in mind, but it's just too hard. Takes too much time. Where you are, it's good enough. It's not the same, but you settle. So Terah settled, and when Abraham was 75, God said to Abraham, I need you to finish what your dad started. I need you to go to Canaan. And when you get to Canaan, I'm going to make of you a great nation. Abraham and Sarah, his wife, had no kids at the time. But they left believing in this promise of God, that God's going to make of Abraham a great nation. And when they arrived in Canaan, for 10 years, God continued to renew this promise. 4 times in the Bible, God tells Abraham, I'm going to just make you a great... See the sand? Your descendants going to be like that, more than you can count. See the stars? Your descendants going to be like that. January, no kids. February, no kids. March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, December. Whole year. Not one kid. I'm going to see the sand. Isn't that awesome? Look at the stars. Isn't that awesome? Second year, no kids. Third year, no kids. Fourth year, no kids. Fifth year, no kids. Sixth year, no kids. Seventh year, no kids. Eighth year, no kids. Ninth year, no kids. 10th year, Sarah says, Abraham, this promise is to you. I don't know if it includes me. I've got a handmaid. Why don't you have a relationship with her? So this is like a surrogate mom. And we'll just, and you can father a child through her. Sarah hadn't really figured out, I don't think, how she would deal with it if her plan worked out. And probably Abraham didn't figure it out either. But they decided to do this, and so Ishmael was born. And then, with the birth of Ishmael, Sarah figured out it was her fault. Abraham was fertile, she was not. And there was a constant reminder of this first little baby, and then toddler, and then growing young boy, that Sarah couldn't have kids. So Sarah had to work through her bitterness and anger and resentment and all the stuff. And when Ishmael was 13, God showed up, or spoke to Abraham and Sarah both independently, and they both laughed. God said, you're going to have a kid, Sarah. That promise to Abraham, now 24 years old, that, Sarah, includes you. Abraham's been talking about the sands and the stars. That promise includes you, Sarah. Sarah heard it and laughed. Abraham heard it and laughed. Abraham was 99 and Sarah was 89. Abraham says, can a child be born to a man who's 100? Can Sarah, who's 90, bear a child? They were in the age between Noah and our day. So before the days of Noah, the Bible records that people lived extraordinarily long lives. God intended for people to live forever, perhaps. At the beginning of creation, people were living 900 years, 800 years. But at the time of Noah, God said, that is it. I can't stand it anymore. I had not figured out that people were going to sin and live long. That's horrible. Because a 900-year-old sinner, they can get pretty wicked by that many years. So God says that with Noah, God says, that's it, 120 years, that's going to be the limit. That's as much as I can stand. So at the time of Noah, the years started going down. But God always works in process. So God said 120 years, that's the limit. After the flood, they would live 400 years. 400 years. Next generation, 200 years, more than 200 years. But the numbers started declining. And Abraham and Sarah were in this time between Noah and the flood and our present day, where it was not unusual for a person to live a long time, a couple hundred years. So it's not the same as us finding a woman who's 90 giving birth to a child. But in their day, it still would be unusual for Sarah to give birth at 90. God said, oh yeah, that's going to happen. Now, and Abraham says, let Ishmael be the one. God says, I love Ishmael. Ishmael's going to have 12 princes coming from him. It's an awesome, awesome plan I have for Ishmael, but that's not the blessing that I have in mind for you. It's going to be through Isaac, a child not yet born. Going to be through Sarah. Isaac means laughter. So God says, you both laughed, your kid's going to be laughter. That's his name. I will establish my covenant with him. There's just one thing, Abraham, you have to get circumcised. Turns out, wasn't Sarah's fault. Sarah was fertile. Once Abraham was circumcised, they had a child. Some years pass. Excuse me. This child grows. God says, Abraham. Abraham's had a long history, knows God's voice. Abraham says, here I am. God says, you know, Isaac, that person that I said was going to bless everybody, sand and stars and all that bit, you know that, Isaac? I want you to take him to the land of Moriah and offer him as a burnt offering. Abraham loved God, followed God, did what God said. Abraham got his son, packed up some kindling and a knife, headed off for the mountains. They made the whole journey together. They got to the mountains. Abraham got an altar, put his son on it, got the knife out, was ready to kill him. In the story, at this point, an angel interrupts and says, okay, I can see you mean it. Stop. It's not one of the easiest stories in the Bible. But that spot, 2 Chronicles says, Solomon was going to build a house to God, a temple in Jerusalem, and he built it on Mount Moriah. That place where Abraham had to sacrifice his son, or at least show that he was willing to. That was the place where the temple was built, Chronicles says, where people sacrificed all the time for their sin until Jesus died in that city for all time and all place, for all the sins of all the people. When God asks you to give up all your possessions, I believe it means include your kids, your parents, the things you love, the dreams that you have. God speaks to you and tells you, I'm going to give you as many descendants as there are stars and sand. You have to give that up too. If you're not willing to give up the dreams that God plants in you, you can't follow Jesus. You can come to church, sing in the choir, be on council, do lots of things, but not follow Jesus. Jesus tells his disciples, we're going to Jerusalem, and that's where he died. John says, God loved the world so much that he gave his only son. What God is asking of you, God has already done. God is asking you to become like God, generous and giving of everything. We're going to take a moment for prayer. God, there's some people today that it's the first time they figured out the cost. Or they haven't completely figured it out. They haven't processed it, but they realize that the cost is far more than they were thinking. So we ask that you help us to figure the cost of following Jesus and to do a proper accounting. To not only figure the cost of following Jesus, but also the cost of not following Jesus. Thank you for your mercy. We praise you. There's a Bible study Wednesday. The handout in your program has the texts and the questions that we'll be considering. If you can't make it Wednesday, it'd be really strategic for you to get a couple friends and go over these topics, because you'll hear about them today, but it probably won't be enough to change your life. For some people, there are messages that they hear that they remember a decade later and it's still helping them. But for most of us, we need reinforcement, and we need the encouragement of friends and family to help us. And we also need their weird ideas. If you by yourself will have some strange ideas and not recognize how strange they are until you get with a group of other people who have their own strange ideas. And then hearing all of the ideas is very, very helpful to you and to them. So I'd encourage you, if you aren't coming Wednesday night to the Bible study here, to form your own Bible study. We'll have texts like this. They're part of our newsletter every week, so if people sign up for our newsletter, they'll get that.